Mr. Attorney General, why do you say that the FBI opened the investigation of the Trump campaign on the thinnest of suspicions?
Well, I'm glad to get into the issue of predication, but let me just start out by saying that I think you have to put this in context. I think the heart of the IG's report really focused on how the investigation was conducted once it got going, and that is especially the very serious abuses of FISA that occurred, much of which has been, in my view, not accurately reported by the press over the last day. But in one area, I do disagree with the IG, and that was whether there was sufficient predication to open a full-blown counterintelligence investigation, specifically using the techniques that they did to collect intelligence about the Trump campaign.
Well, as a policy matter, why not open an investigation on a thin pretext? I guess on the one hand, you could say it's a presidential campaign, it's very sensitive, you need better evidence. On the other hand, you could say it's a presidential campaign. We have to be very careful. There could be a threat to our political process.
Well, I think probably from a civil liberties standpoint, the greatest danger to our free system is that the incumbent government use the apparatus of the state, principally the law enforcement agencies and the intelligence agencies, both to spy on political opponents, but also to use them in a way that could affect the outcome of the election. As far as I'm aware, this is the first time in history that this has been done to a presidential campaign, the use of these counterintelligence techniques against a presidential campaign. And we have to remember that in today's world, presidential campaigns are frequently in contact with foreign persons. And indeed, in most campaigns, there are signs of illegal foreign money coming in. And we don't automatically assume that the campaigns are nefarious and traitors and acting in league with foreign powers. There has to be some basis before we use these very potent powers in our core First Amendment activity. And here, I felt this was very flimsy. Basically, I think the department has a rule of reason, which is at the end of the day, is what you're relying on sufficiently powerful to justify the techniques you're using? And the question there is, how strong is the evidence? How sensitive is the activity you're looking at? And what are the alternatives? And I think when you step back here and say, what was this all based on? It's not sufficient. Remember, there was and never has been any evidence of collusion, and yet this campaign and the president's administration has been dominated by this investigation into what turns out to be completely baseless.
Well, of course, it doesn't turn out that way at the beginning. At the start.
So let's look at
Sure.
look at what the basis of it was. So in May 2016. Apparently a 28-year-old campaign volunteer says in a social setting...
This is George Papadopoulos.
This is George Papadopoulos. And this was described by the foreign official who heard him, as who couldn't remember exactly what was said, but it was characterized as a suggestion of a suggestion. He suggested that there had been a suggestion from the Russians that they had some adverse information to Hillary, which they might dump in the campaign. Well, what was going on in May? You may recall that we were in the thick of the investigation of Hillary Clinton's secret server. And the media was full of stories, and the blogosphere was full of stories, and political circles in Washington were full of stories and speculation that the Russians had, in 2014, 2 years before, hacked into her secret server and were therefore in a position to drop this stuff during the election. In fact, the day before this comment was made in a bar, Fox News was reporting that their sources told them there was a debate going on in the Russian government as to whether or not to drop Hillary Clinton's emails between the intelligence agency and the foreign ministry. But that related to Hillary's server. So the FBI, what the FBI did is later, after the the DNC hack and the dumping through Wikipedia in July. WikiLeaks. In July, they get this information that this somewhat vague statement was made in a bar. And they jumped right into a full-scale investigation before they even went and talked to the foreign officials about exactly what was said. They opened an investigation of the campaign, and they used very intrusive techniques. They didn't do, I think, what would normally be done under those circumstances, which is to go to the campaign. And there certainly were people in the campaign that could be trusted, including a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee and the governor of New Jersey, former U.S. attorney. There were people to talk to. And what I find particularly inexplicable is that they talked to the Russians, but not to the presidential campaign. On August 4th, Brennan braced the head of Russian intelligence. He calls the head of Russian intelligence and says, "We know what you're up to, you better stop it." He did it again later in August, and then President Obama talked to President Putin in September and said, "We know what you're up to, you better cut it out." So they go and confront the Russians, who clearly are the bad guys, and they won't go and talk to the campaigns and say, what is this about?
So the Inspector General says he found no evidence to indicate that the FBI's decision to start this investigation was based on political bias. Do you agree?
Well, I think you have to understand what the IG's methodology is, and I think it's the appropriate methodology for an Inspector General. He starts with limited information. He can only talk to people who are essentially there as employees, and he's limited to the information generally in the FBI. But his approach is to say, if I get an explanation from the people I'm investigating that is not unreasonable on its face, then I will accept it as long as there's not contradictory testimonial or documentary evidence. In other words, it's a very deferential standard. And all he said is, people gave me an explanation and I didn't find anything to contradict it, so I don't have a basis for saying that there was improper motive. But he hasn't decided the issue of improper motive.
Have you?
No. I think we have to wait until the investigation, the full investigation is done, and that's the fundamental distinction between what Durham is doing and what the IG is doing. Durham is not limited to the FBI. He can talk to other agencies. He can compel people to testify. One of the problems in the IG's investigation, I think he would agree, is that Comey refused to sign back up for his security clearance and therefore couldn't be questioned about classified matters. So someone like Durham can compel testimony. He can talk to a whole range of people, private parties, foreign governments, and so forth. And I think that is the point at which a decision has to be made about motivations. And I think right now it would be premature to make any judgment one way or the other.
I just wonder, though, about what the FBI would say, I think, here is, okay, so they opened an investigation. Nobody was ever charged. They were concerned about possible Russian meddling in the election. Why not open this investigation? What's the harm? You've said intrusive means. So what is your concern about the fact that they did this?
Well, I think the big picture is this. From day one, remember, they say, okay, we're not going to go to talk to the campaign. We're going to put people in there, wire them up, and have these conversations with people involved in the campaign, because that way we'll get the truth. From the very first day of this investigation, which was July 31st, 2016, all the way to its end in September 2017, there was not one incriminatory bit of evidence to come in. It was all exculpatory. The people that they were taping denied any involvement with Russia, denied the very specific facts that the FBI was relying on. So what happens? The FBI ignores it, presses ahead, withholds that information from the court, withholds critical exculpatory information from the court while it gets a electronic surveillance warrant. It also withholds from the court clear-cut evidence that the dossier that they ultimately relied on to get the FISA warrant was a complete sham.